Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to check out things that you probably don't know anything about, but if you did, they might change your life. And for the last several months, we've been doing Bible decodes. A lot of them have been focused on the Roman origins hypothesis, basically saying many authors have contended that the Romans were the authors of the New Testament, and they did it mainly as a form of psychological operation or psychological warfare against the Jews, who were a big pain in their butt because the Jews were constantly revolting under the Roman colonial rule. Revolutions and revolts and uprisings and flat-out wars against the Romans, culminating in the War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. And in that war, both the emperors Titus and Vespasian, Vespasian the father, Titus the son, were generals in the war. They eventually became the emperors under the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, 69 to 96 AD. And the theory basically goes that the Flavian emperors wanted to mellow out the Jews, to tame the Jews or domesticate the Jews, so that they would stop revolting all the time and become, good citizens of Rome. And so they knew that the Romans, that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, but that the Messiah that they were waiting for was a military commander who would help them throw out the Romans. So instead, they wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, turning the other cheek to oppression, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack, believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and exhorting his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do, while at the very same time going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the money changers, changing the graven images money of the Romans to the kosher money of the Jews, so that they could be used in the offering inside the temple, and disrupting the commerce of the Jews who were out there selling pigeons and doves for the sacrifice to be conducted in the ritual inside the temple. So the Jesus here of the Romans is very much anti-Jewish rituals and very deferential to the Romans, giving some credence to this theory. As well, the Romans really are the only people who could have done this. They're the only people that spoke and wrote fluently in Greek, compared to the Aramaic-speaking Jews in Judea. Very few Jews spoke or wrote in Greek, the language of the New Testament. And the Romans had a monopoly on censorship. They had a monopoly on publishing. They had a monopoly on distribution. They were really the only people that could have done this. This was also right in the MO of the Romans. They had created a number of other religions in the first century that were designed as psychological operations against one group or another, including the Jews. And the main evidence, however, lies in all of the parallels that exist between the story in the Gospels and the history that is written about this war against the Jews, which is called War of the Jews, or Jewish War, by a guy named Josephus. And Josephus admits in his autobiography that he was a member of the Flavian dynasty. He was an adopted member, adopted by Vespasian, brought to Rome to live in a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and made one of the court historians under Vespasian and Titus. Titus gives his enthusiastic endorsement of Josephus's 7-volume War of the Jews. And if you read the story in War of the Jews, you will recognize unmistakable parallels between the story of the Gospels and the history of Josephus. Sometimes Jesus' story is parodying the War of the Jews, and sometimes War of the Jews is parodying the Gospels. It is a mutual parodying, meaning that the stories were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. We're looking at the work of Michael Menescot's today, and have been for quite a while here. His new book that is called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And what Menescot's does is, that's M-E-N-A-S-G-O-T-Z, he delves into, in particular, the book of Luke, and finds parallels between the book of Luke and Josephus's War of the Jews. He finds an astounding minimum of 250 parallels just in the book of Luke, and he presents them all here in this book. I think he's presented most of them in the videos that we've already done. Right now he's kind of going over some of the statistical evidence. What are the chances that something like this would happen? But in addition to finding the 250 parallels, he charts them on a graph, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Wherever he finds a parallel, he puts a dot there. After putting all 250 plus dots on the page, he has discovered that he has created 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, which you can see on the thumbnail for this video. APTVS. I think it's undoubted that the TVS stands for Titus Vespasianus. They use that on coins as well that they minted during this period. The AP could be for Arius Piso, who was kind of a shadow emperor under Vespasian and Titus, or Agianuma, Numa with a P, that means the Holy Spirit. So that would be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Either way, not only did the Romans write the New Testament, but they signed their name to it. And so this is evidence that you should not ignore if you are a seeker after truth. I'm not telling you what to believe, but I am telling you that this is at least a prima facie case that you should investigate if you are actually interested in the truth, as opposed to interested in stroking your current beliefs about what things are. Many people who will be watching this video are diggers, people who consider themselves part of the truther movement. Well, the truther movement doesn't mean that you ignore things that don't comport with your current beliefs. It means that you challenge those beliefs. And it also means that you recognize that everything that we've been told our whole lives have been lies. And this is no exception. Just because it goes further back in history and it's maybe a little bit more difficult to document and to research, the research is there, and the research is unequivocal. And so as of right now, I really don't see that there is any evidence whatsoever for the accepted story of the origin of the New Testament that was written by semi-literate followers of Jesus in Judea. It makes a whole lot more sense to me to think that it was written by the Romans as part of a psychological operation, and that Jesus is pure fiction. Maybe not pure fiction, maybe it's based on somebody else's life, but that is something that can be debated. But the Roman origins hypothesis, as far as I'm concerned, checks every single box. There is nothing that it doesn't explain. And it goes a lot further than that, which I'm not going to get into right now because I'd like to let Menescats do some of the talking here, because we're at a section that is called Summary of the Evidence Presented So Far. I have presented several independent methods for showing that the APTVS pattern is genuine. Firstly, I showed that Jesus' story parallels Titus's story. Titus, the general in the War of the Jews. Wherever Titus goes, Jesus goes. In the same order, this is my words right now, but wherever Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order. And whatever adventures that Titus finds himself in, a parallel adventure awaits Jesus at the same place, and with a 40-year gap between. So the authors of the New Testament wrote the story in the 70s, but backdated it to the 30s. Jesus's ministry goes from 30 to 33 AD. Titus's military campaign goes from 70 to 73 AD. The events that occur exactly 40 years apart, sometimes to the very hour. And okay, so firstly I showed that Jesus' story parallels Titus's in immense detail, and that Josephus' story parodies Jesus' story similarly in incredible detail. These opposed parodies in which, and you can check this for yourself. You can get yourself a copy of Josephus online as a PDF for free, and you can check his parallels. You can probably find some of your own, although many of them are incredibly well hidden, as well as some of them being very obvious. Some of them are weak, but when there are over 250 of them, you have to recognize that some of them are going to be weak, especially to fit this APTVS pattern that they're trying to fit. Okay, these opposed parodies in which both Luke and Jewish War work to parody each other's core narratives in such detail could only have been achieved via editorial control over both stories. While identifying the parallels is an effort requiring subjective analysis of whether a conceptual similarity is noteworthy or appears to be intentional, there are so many very clear examples and groups that follow such coherent themes that although I might have erred on a few of them, it is inarguable or unarguable to an open-minded person, that is, that these mutually opposed parodies are present. Since two such interwoven stories can only be created together, this shows that they have the same origin. And since we know that Josephus is writing as a member of the Flavian dynasty at Caesar's palace, that would be the origin of the New Testament as well. In doing so, I showed that the parallels in these parodies are arranged such that when their locations are plotted, the notable parallels are very preferentially arranged in a pattern, namely the lines forming the 5 Latin letters APTVS. or most of it anyway. I will complete this task shortly. To make the two stories be parodies of each other and to simultaneously position those parallels such as to create the APTVS pattern is simply impossible without editorial control over both stories. To reiterate the key point, the APTVS pattern could only have been constructed with editorial control over both Jewish War and Luke, showing that they have the same origin. Having described these parallels, I then showed that if the APTVS pattern was a case of finding a pattern in noise, a biased selection, the level of detail in the pattern necessitates that there must have been a huge number of coincidental yet noteworthy parallels there in order to be selected from. In particular, I demonstrated that the finding patterns in noise scenario isn't merely implausible, but rather is impossible, since for Luke to contain the necessary numbers of parallels would require it to be 4 times longer than it is. And he mentions that the book of Luke is only 1,151 verses, and to be able to find 250 parallels, and some of the parallels require many, many verses to, lay out. It basically means that the book of Luke is entirely saturated with parallels to War of the Jews. I also repeated that assessment to determine how much of Jewish War would need to be filled with coincidental parallels, concluding that it would need to be entirely filled with notable yet coincidental parallels with Luke, again showing that the APTVS pattern cannot be a case of finding a pattern in noise. Then I showed that since the APTVS pattern contains at least 250 parallels and fills only 25% of the chart area, and at most 100 parallels don't align with it, the odds of this occurring by chance are about 1 in 100 billion. That is 10 to the 47th. 1 in 10 to the 47th. I also showed that if a critic were to assert that I am underplaying the number of non-matching parallels, this requires that the entirety of Luke consists of noteworthy parallels with Jewish War, which can only be explained by accepting that the documents are intentionally parallel and the opposed parodies I describe are real, with its inevitable conclusion being that Luke has the same origin as Jewish War, i.e. the Roman government. Then I showed that Cliff Carrington's independently identified parallels are aligned with the APTVS pattern. So another author who found parallels also in the New Testament with War of the Jews, the parallels that he located also aligned with the APTVS pattern. I think there are a couple of exceptions, but this lends great confidence to the painstaking work identifying the pattern as being the 5 Latin letters. I think he identified a couple of them that didn't fit the pattern, and the ones that didn't fit the pattern were really weak. So I think he only identified like 25 of them, and like 4 or 5 of them didn't fit the pattern, and they were the weakest ones of the lot. Okay, APTVS with odds of this degree of alignment occurring by chance being most reasonably 1 in a million, or at least 1 in 25,000. So that has to be multiplied by the 1 in 10 to the 47th. That's 1 with 47 zeros after it. So then you multiply it by put another 3 zeros after it. Lastly, I showed that the way both stories evoke each step in the Passover ritual once or twice, and in 21 cases, those parallels are sufficiently non-subjective as to leave little room for argument, which itself is so improbable as to have the odds of it occurring by chance as being 1 in 65,000. throw 3 plus more zeros on the end there. Then I showed for all 21 of those parallels to match the APTVS pattern is improbable, with odds of 1 in 4 million, which I think is actually incorrect math. I believe it's 1 in 4 trillion, 10 to the 24th, lending further support to the APTVS pattern being genuine. And I also showed that the way they are clustered is itself improbable, with the odds of 1 in 1,000 billion. That is a trillion. So we'll just add another 24 zeros. Now we're up to 77 zeros, which lends further support to the two stories being written as a single literary work. Taken together, this enables us to be completely certain that the APTVS pattern is genuine, intentional, and the result of jointly editing the stories in Luke and Jewish War. Although the idea of Jesus probably already existed in the Pauline literature, which I would strongly disagree with. I believe that the Pauline literature was written by Pliny the Younger, and the work of Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso pretty much demonstrates this, along with the work of Sir Ronald Syme, who looked into Pliny's writings and showed his various aliases. Sir Ronald Syme is known as the greatest Roman historian of the 20th century, writing at Oxford, and he tracked all this down. The Romans loved to use pseudonyms such as Josephus, who probably also didn't exist, and Pliny used a couple of aliases, so it's hard to track him down, but Pliny himself wrote epistles, just like Paul, and the evidence is very strong that Pliny wrote these epistles much later than the Gospels. The only evidence that exists that shows that we all assume that the Pauline literature was written before the Gospels is because Paul could have alluded to the Gospels in many places, but did not. Meaning that Paul did not know about the Gospels, which they assumed that he would have, and so they assumed that he wrote before the Gospels because he didn't cite them when he needed to. Incidentally, Paul, the literature of Paul, is even more pro-Roman than Jesus' literature. So it's even more of a psychological operation than the Gospels are. So this proves that the good news story of Jesus in Luke has the same origin as the story of Titus and Vespasian in Jewish War, which in turn is undeniably the product of the Roman government under the authority of the Flavian emperors Vespasian and Titus. While Joseph Atwill, who is the author of the two great books, Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, which were really the introduction to this topic for many readers and for the 21st century. And he found innumerable parallels as well, not just in the book of Luke, but in Revelation, in the epistles, and in the other Gospels. And Atwill also examines not only just Josephus's work, but he digs into an author, a second century Roman author named Suetonius, and shows how much of the imagery in the book of Revelation is directly from Suetonius. Suetonius wrote a book that is called The 12 Emperors, and this book shows the details of these various emperors' lives. And Emperor Domitian, who is Titus's younger brother, in the section on Domitian, it explains his throne room, like the room where he has his throne and the various people that are his employees, his priests and his, helpers, and the various things that occur in his throne room. And it is exactly what's going on in the book of Revelation in terms of the imagery. While Joseph Atwill's evidence, including identifying how Jesus' story parallels Titus's victories in Jewish war, pointed very clearly to a Roman Flavian government origin for the story of Jesus, my work finally proves it. So, Menescats goes over this, he basically is adding on to the work of Atwill in a major way, though, because Atwill only identified maybe 100 parallels. Menescats is adding a few hundred more. Okay, so I guess we are at the next chapter. Let me make sure I'm on the right page here. Okay, I am. Okay, so this is chapter 18. It's called Completing the APTVS Pattern. In my published articles, I described further parallels which complete the A and the P, the left-hand side of the chart. And if you look at the thumbnail, you can see that the A and the P are much more poorly developed than the V and the S, for example, and even the T. The parallels in the A and the P are also considerably weaker than the parallels in the V and the S. The hypothesis here is that the A and the P, that those sections of Josephus, the beginning of the book, which harkens back to far before the beginning of this war against the Jews, it gives you background material, goes all the way back to 150 BC or something, that this was written later, possibly by Emperor Domitian or some emperor later than Vespasian, for sure. And so it was kind of slapped together much more, with much less care than the VS part of the chart at the end of War of the Jews. So in this book, I will relegate most of these to an appendix, the A and the P parallels, for the interested reader, on the basis that they generally do not contain hidden messages like some of the parallels in the V and the S. And the hidden messages are generally very mean-spirited, mocking, ruthless, and ridiculing of the Jews and anybody who is believing in the text. And so that includes all Christians who are reading it now. You are being mocked and ridiculed by the Romans in these. Once you figure out how to read it, you have to read it with Josephus. Okay. They do not contain hidden messages, the ones in the A and the P, and frequently are weaker. I have already shown the reader some of them anyway, namely those forming the right-hand edge of the A. Showing some of them is still worthwhile, so I will describe about half of them below, the ones I found most interesting. The first example is the only one where I identified the presence of a coherent theme, and where Jewish war repeats a silly story about an attempt to poison Herod, a theme that the text keeps reverting to across a considerable number of paragraphs. Notice that this large story in Jewish war only mirrors a single location in Luke, and indeed not in an especially impressive manner either. This reflects that the left-hand side of the pattern and the AP may all be a later addition after publication of Luke, while the author was able to arrange parallels as he pleased within Jewish war, he apparently did not have the freedom to also adjust the text in Luke to suit it. To me, this suggests that Luke may have already been published when the second and surviving version of Jewish war was being written. Okay, so Josephus does say that the Greek version of War of the Jews is the second version, but the first version was never discovered. He says that the first version is in the father tongue, which scholars think that he means is written in Chaldee, which is an ancient Sumerian location and language that many Jews of the Eastern Roman Empire spoke. But many other scholars believe that the father tongue just means that the first part was written by Vespasian and the second part was written by his son Titus. And so his son is saying it was written in my father's tongue. I tend toward the latter. Okay, so this section is called How the Story in War of the Jews Parodies Luke. And he starts with Jewish War, paragraph 202. That's book 1, chapter 31, paragraph 1. Herod discovered that they had brought a second poison in case the first did not work, adding that it was a poison of asps, which is a snake. This links poison with serpents and other creeping, crawling things, which covers snakes, reptiles, and perhaps scorpions, is what he says in the parentheses. Now, he's also going to be quoting Jewish War 55 to 56, book 1, chapter 9, paragraphs 1 and 2. But envy prevented the hopes of Caesar, for Aristobulus was killed by poison given him by those of Pompey's party. And they also killed his son by beheading. And this is Jewish War 73. Cassius promised that Herod would be king of Judea after the war, and so these brilliant expectations of the son proved the occasion of his father Antipater's destruction. For Malchus corrupted one of the king's cupbearers with money to give a poisoned portion to Antipater. So he became a sacrifice to his wickedness and died after leaving the banquet. Jewish War 94. Phasaelus, brother of Herod, prevented all abuses by dashing his head against a stone, but Antigonus ordered physicians to cure it, but they had